There is so much incriminating evidence against Sheriff John Feyen and Sheriff Justin Smith that it is difficult to know where to begin. It's also difficult to tell this story in a way that is cohesive due to the sheer volume of information. As I was driving to the Estes Park Police Department, numerous thoughts came to mind, and I just started recording as I was driving. This video comes with a trigger warning. If you are a survivor of domestic violence or your children have been abused, I will be discussing domestic violence and child abuse in the context of the cases against Justin Smith and John Feyen, so please be advised. My primary focus as an investigative journalist is on the justice system, criminal justice system, civil cases. My interest is in malicious prosecutions and wrongful convictions. The motivation for my interest in these is deep within my being. I can remember as a very young child wondering about truth and justice, and at the time as a second or third grader I couldn't understand some things that I was seeing. And when I was in, I think it was second or third grade, I lived in a small town in the southeast, and I remember at the end of the school day the black children in my class would sit in a different bus line than the white children, and being 7 or 8 years old I didn't understand why, but it always felt wrong to me. So as I grew up, the law and truth and justice became a passion of mine. That is why I do what I do. In addition to the criminal justice system and the justice system in general, I have focused intensely on local governments and the corruption that is present in local governments. Before I became a target of the old blood Republicans, Justin Smith, John Feyen, Cliff Riedel, Larry Abrahamson, before I became their target, I was a public speaker. I was known throughout the United States and as well as overseas for being an excellent researcher and also being a effective public speaker. That is one of the reasons I became a target of the local corrupt officials. Now, when I talk about the old blood Republicans, I want you to understand that I really don't care what your party affiliation is. I am politically neutral. What I want to know about, what I'm interested in is, are you a law-abiding human being? Do you respect the truth? Do you honor justice? I want to know who you are as a human. I don't care if you're an R or a D or an I or a nothing. What I want to know is if you are serving the people, are you telling the truth, and are you representing those people? Are you obeying the law? Are you following the Constitution? That's what I want to know. So that's why I became a target. In Larimer County, the Republicans have controlled the office of sheriff and the district attorney's office for decades. That has caused some gigantic problems with a core group of officials who are corrupt, whose power has hurt a vast number of people in Larimer County. And that's why in 2024, John Feyen and Justin Smith are the defendants in 2 separate lawsuits, because when I began to expose their criminal actions, now these are the former sheriff and the current sheriff, when I began to expose their criminal actions that span nearly 2 decades, they went on a vicious mission to discredit me. Before I became the target of corrupt officials in the state of Colorado, and specifically in Larimer County, my clients included law enforcement officers, elected officials at the state and local level, former military, active military, city council members. So I had a very meaningful existence as an investigative journalist, as a researcher, as a public speaker, and that translated into very successful resistance and change at the local and state level as far as policies and procedures and rules that were hurting the majority of the community. In 2010, some significant victories were had that protected local business owners, and then as a result negatively impacted local governments who wanted to control those business owners. And that is when the retaliation against me personally, because of my work as a journalist, took some unimaginable nasty turns. That the only way they were going to silence me or to interfere with my work and my effectiveness was to go after the most sacred, precious aspect of my life. This is a very difficult video to make because it is intensely personal, it is intensely painful, and they used my child to as a political weapon. It's tragic in 2024 that it's still difficult for domestic violence to be discussed openly. That's part of the game for domestic violence abusers, is they know that their targets of domestic violence will not likely come forward because it's embarrassing, it's shameful, there's humiliation. The way the rich white men still control women is tragic, but it is a reality. So after 22 years of experiencing domestic violence by the biological male, it's a part of this story. It's a horrible truth. Sheriff John Feyen was involved in the domestic violence case from the outset. This was when he was still a lieutenant with the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. He testified under oath that he believed the reports of domestic violence, partially because he had audio of the abuser, he had emails from the abuser, he had numerous direct evidence of domestic violence abuse. And as a side note, domestic violence abuse is child abuse. There is no separation. If you believe that a woman can be abused by her partner and that is not automatically child abuse, then you're vastly mistaken. A lot of district attorneys' offices believe that They can go to domestic violence training once a year, or they can study it in a book. But unless you are actually engaging with domestic violence abuse survivors and their children, these law enforcement agencies and district attorneys' offices are missing the picture. They're completely missing the opportunities for justice, true justice in these cases, because domestic violence abusers are often expert manipulators, expert controllers, and they get away with murder at times, and many times they get away with devastating injuries to the target of their abuse, which is often the mother and the children. Domestic violence abusers use children to further terrorize the mother. Now look, I understand that there are men who are victims of domestic violence abuse. I am not discounting your experience as victims of women who are narcissistic psychopaths, because they do exist. But I am focused on the female victims, the women who are victims, because that is far more likely the case. In 2011, the Department of Justice funded a study, it's called the Saunders Study, to determine exactly what was happening with domestic violence abuse, the survivors, the children victims. And you can get that Department of Justice Saunders study free online. If you're in the business of helping domestic violence abuse survivors or their children, if you don't know about the Saunders study, you're missing out. Also, Barry Goldstein, Mo Hanna, and Maria Liu, I believe. Not sure about the Liu part. Anyway, Barry Goldstein is a domestic violence abuse expert. He was an attorney in New York for many years who represented the children and women victims of domestic violence abuse. He's the most logical, rational, law-minded advocate for victims. There are other judges and attorneys who have adopted as specialties their focus on domestic violence abuse, because it is the most destructive aspect of society. Law enforcement agencies, some specific law enforcement officers, some district attorneys, some private attorneys still tend to be extremely prejudiced and extremely biased against women victims and their children because of the rich white man syndrome, meaning that women and children are not to be believed. The men are to be believed by default. And when that is the case, judges are also included in that prejudicial, biased group of people who believe that if women and children are describing domestic violence abuse, then they must have some kind of ulterior motive. That's just absolute bullshit. Most women and children who are victims are telling the truth. Every victim has their own story and their own specific experiences. Each person who has been victimized by domestic violence abuse or child abuse has their own way of reacting to that abuse. And if you don't fit the standardized explanation for how a victim should react or should be behaving, then they discount you. Many times the women and children have had to be very creative to figure out ways to survive the abuse, and to outsiders that can often look like a very odd way to react or a way to behave. But until you have been in an abusive relationship, You have no room to judge those women and children for their reactions or how they choose to handle it. Oftentimes they are surviving on a moment-by-moment basis. If the woman or the child has been a victim of psychological abuse or financial abuse or emotional abuse, that can often be much more damaging than physical abuse. I know that's hard to believe, but the most devious, dark domestic violence abusers and child abusers know that they should not ever leave any physical signs of abuse. And that means they often turn to wicked methods to control and to hurt the women and children. So back to John Feyen and Justin Smith. What John Feyen and Justin Smith say under oath, as in they swear to tell the truth as cops, is radically different from what they tell the public. John Feyen has basically been groomed from the time he was very young as a law enforcement officer to infect every city, town in Larimer County. In fact, in 2002, he destroyed an Estes Park businessman's personal and professional life. And that man is still suffering from what John Feyen did to him in 2002. John Feyen and Justin Smith, as the sheriff of Larimer County and the former sheriff of Larimer County, have done inconceivable depths of damage in my life, in my child's life, in all of my family's past, present, and future because of what they did to my child. And the damage they did to us is ongoing. There is no resolution to those cases. They continue to involve an innocent child in covering up their own crimes. It is incomprehensible to me how desperate they have become and their tactics, but the public has a right to know that this is who the sheriff of Larimer County is. To this day, it is excruciating for me to talk about the domestic violence abuse. It's awkward to talk about it publicly, but because John Feyen and Justin Smith made it public, and because I have not had a chance to tell the truth of the story and actually use court documents and show the law enforcement records, the last 3 years have been just very difficult to survive because of the emotional and psychological pain that Smith and Feyen have caused, on top of all of the domestic violence abuse. And if you're not familiar with how domestic violence abusers work, please know that many of them use the court system to further abuse the children and their target. John Feyen repeatedly testified under oath that he believed my reports of domestic violence abuse. He had audio evidence from the abuser. He had email evidence from the abuser. And just recently, the abuser himself went on social media and, in a twisted public post, admitted to child abuse. So I'm not making simple allegations or mere supposition. I'm not just thinking that, well, it might have been abuse, or maybe it wasn't really child abuse. That's not the case here. I have years and years of documented evidence of domestic violence abuse and child abuse. I'm not going to go into the details, obviously, to protect the innocent child that is involved in this, and I'm not going to be specific about what the domestic violence abuser did. It's all documented, and frankly, it's a very private and a very painful reality. But it's important that you know the background for how Sheriff Justin Smith and Sheriff John Feyen have exploited an innocent child being abused, and me being in a relationship that was full domestic violence.